I'm delighted to introduce you to today's speaker, who is Dr. Anna Burton from the University of Derby, appropriately. And she's going to talk about Dracula's Cape. Her presentation is Dracula's Cape and a Cloaked Novel. So, Anna, thank you very much for joining us. Over to you.
No problem. Thanks, Duncan. I'll just share my screen. And apologies everyone in advance if I sound a little bit tinny. I did try to use headphones to make me sound a little bit better, but they didn't work. So unfortunately, you're stuck with a tinny version of me. So I do apologize if the sound quality isn't great. That's a problem on my end. Okay, so Dracula's Cape and a Cloaked Novel. So through a reading of Dracula in 1887 at London's Lyceum Theatre, Bram Stoker first secured copyrights for a stage production of his novel. But it was not until after the author's death, and of course several years later, that the first theatrical adaptation of the text was staged, as we've just been hearing about. After gaining permission from the author's widow, Florence Stoker, Hamilton Dean, pictured on the right of this slide here, penned the adaptation in the space of 4 weeks. He already had connections to Stoker, as his grandfather lived next door to the author's father back in County Dublin, and in also being part of the Henry Irving Company. Of course, Irving is reputed to have been Stoker's inspiration for Count Dracula. By the time he came to write the play, Dean was already a proficient actor and stage producer in his own right. And before Dracula, he had already produced a number of melodramas with his own touring company in the 1920s. And it was perhaps this knowledge of provincial theatres that led him to select Derby's Grand Theatre as the premier site for his production of Dracula in 1924. This is, of course, the starting point for my talk on the significance of Dracula's Cape or Cloak, its presence in the text and in the novel's subsequent adaptation too. And for the 1924 play, Dean cast Edmund Blake in the main role and himself as Van Helsing, which apparently he chose over the Count because it had more lines and therefore more stage time. And in order to make the Derby production of Dracula work on a budget, Dean cropped Stoker's narrative down. So he edited out the opening scenes, including Harker's captivity at Castle Dracula, and the closing scenes with the kind of dramatic chase back into Transylvania, to make it more of a kind of drawing room melodrama. And after being licensed for performance by the Lord Chamberlain's office on the 6th of May, the premiere took place at Derby's Grand Theatre on Thursday, the 15th of May, 1924, with Florence Stoker in attendance. On the following day, a review appeared in the Daily Telegraph, or the Derby Daily Telegraph, rather, in which it was recorded that when the curtain fell at 11 p.m, half the audience were left in a frenzy of applause, while the remainder were in a state of nervous prostration. So there's a sense that it evoked just as melodramatic responses in the audience then. And in the review, the production itself is assessed in rather entertaining terms. While under the spell of the breathless action and excellent acting, one forgets the absolute twaddle to which one is listening. The utter drivel of werewolves, vampires, and undead, which provokes nothing but laughter in the same light of day, becomes dreadful reality in the awful semi-darkness of the stage. So the quality of the acting supersedes the twaddle of the script, and the utter drivel of its supernatural features only becomes laced with menace in the darkness of the theatre. So despite this somewhat mixed bag of a review, Hamilton Dean's Dracula was an apparent success. After its run in Derby, rather, and other kind of provincial theatres. And despite Dean's reluctance to have it reviewed by London critics, it arrived on the London stage in 1927. And for this production, and as a bit of a gimmick, Guardian nurses were in attendance with smelling salts and brandy to come to the aid of any faint-hearted members of the audience. And it was also in London where it was seen by the American stage producer Horace Liveright, who then adapted Dean's version and took it to Broadway in that same year. And it was in the US production and subsequent Universal Pictures film wherein Bela Lugosi first appeared as the Count. And I think it's also worthwhile to note that Hamilton Dean is also one of the credited writers on the screenplay of the 1931 film, as you can see on the slide there, directed by Todd Browning. So we can very much see a clear inheritance, kind of clear link from the 1924 Derby production to Dracula's on-screen afterlives into the 20th century and beyond. And in his book on Hollywood Gothic, David Scarl gives an excellent overview of the production process. And I'd highly recommend having a look at it if you're kind of interested in the cultural history of Dracula adaptation. And in this book, Scarl notes that in the wake of F.W. Murnau's 1922 film, Nosferatu, Florence Stoker took the production company to court for copyright infringement. Though Stoker's novel is credited in the film as a kind of inspiration for Nosferatu, they never actually sought a license from the author's estate. And Scarl goes on to suggest that this is because, or rather it was because of this, that because of this sort of stressful ordeal, that Florence approved Dean's adaptation as a means to kind of reassert some control over her husband's legacy. And much more than this, it suggested that, as it says in the quote, she was comfortable with or even had a hand in creating the new image of the master vampire in evening dress and opera cloak, one polite enough to be invited into a proper Knightsbridge living room. So Florence wanted Count Dracula to move away from the bestial characterization captured in Nosferatu's Count Orlok and to move towards a more kind of domesticated vampire, a somewhat more sanitized image. And we can see the contrast on the slide here between Max Schreck as Count Orlok at the top in the 1922 film and Raymond Huntley with his opera cloak in the 1927 London stage show. Furthermore, as Scarl notes, it's the latter that had the greatest staying power in Dracula's history. And so it was in the Hamilton Dean adaptation from 1924 onwards wherein Dracula first appeared with a cape. And in his plans for the play, Dean initially wanted to begin the production with a prologue that featured Dracula climbing down the walls of the castle, a later scene in the novel, which I'll go back to in a little bit. And in the stage notes, it stated that the Inverness cape, which he wears, must be heavily wired, so that when face downward, it assumes the shape of a bat's wings. So ultimately, this idea was scrapped as it was too expensive, as you might imagine. But the image was apparently still using kind of the promotional materials for the show. From the outset then, Dracula's cape was supposed to be a central prop. And though Dean's notes suggest the use of an Inverness cape, a kind of formal coat with a cape pictured here on the slide, with which he wanted to create a kind of bat-like effect. It's evident from later reports and images that in actuality, something like a priest's funeral cape and later an opera cloak was actually used in the production. Now, the use of a cape to imitate the vampire's bat-like persona wasn't an original conception. It had been used at least 9 years previously in the French vampire film Les Vampires, notably not a Dracula adaptation. Nevertheless, from the 1924 stage adaptation, play rather, to the US adaptations, the cape remains an integral aspect of the production. And as you can see from these images of Bela Lugosi, it's an opaque but very kind of fluid material that encompasses his person, his shadows, and the space around him. And I don't think it's unfair to say that the cape was integral to and a kind of extension of Lugosi's physical performance. And as Anne Featherstone summarises in her own research on this topic, that whilst Dracula's cloak made him appear strange, old-fashioned, even foreign, its prime function was in the realms of stage trickery. It enabled him to disappear on stage. It covered the actor and enabled him to slip unseen through the scene trap. This piece of the costume had a narrative and theatrical function there. And Dorota Babila similarly suggests that the cape inherited from the stage version was an influential and ongoing feature of this vampiric costume. For Babila, like Featherstone, it brings to mind a figure of a circus magician and his tricks and illusions. It evokes Dracula's trickery in the original narrative, but also emphasises his subsequent heritage on the stage. Elsewhere, Jessica Niebel, the curator of the Academy Museum, where Lugosi's original cape is held, notes that the cape makes Dracula a more classy, elegant, sophisticated person a nobleman, not so much a monster per se. And this would certainly fit with Florence Stoker's and Hamilton Dean's ambitions for the image of the vampire. Though I think we might quibble whether Dracula can ever not be seen as a monster in any form he takes. But Nebel's description certainly gets at how the cape elevates the Count's persona beyond his monstrosity. In addition to this, though, Nebel draws attention to the kind of sexual connotations that the cape also has. He covers victims with his cape before he bites them. We never actually see it. He's essentially a predator who drinks women's blood, and in many ways the cape is significant to the sexual appeal of Dracula. Nebel's comment lines up very much with the kind of body of literary scholarship, notably Christopher Craft's work that explores the sexual significance of vampirism and the specific expression of vampirism in Stoker's novel. A notable example in the 1931 film that sees the cape function as part of a kind of blood-sucking exchange is the scene in which Lugosi's Dracula sort of embraces Mina in the garden and sort of envelops her whole body within the cloak at the same time. And this is very much similar to the kind of stills that we see on the slide to some degree, the promotional material for the film on the left, and also the image on the right is promotional material, but for Browning's later film, Mark of the Vampire, which also confusingly featured Bela Lugosi as Count Mora, not Count Dracula. So it's very much evoking the same kind of visual and literary tropes in that film. But regardless of which version, this gesture might be interpreted as a sexualized embrace as much as one that enables a drawing of blood. And in both instances, the cape also veils and obscures whatever is happening underneath. And alongside its performative and symbolic associations, for Mary Ann Kaws, the cape that Lugosi wears has come to signify a vampiredom more broadly. But as well as this, Kaws remarks that in the use of the cape-turned-cloak, an item of clothing with origins in the Middle Ages, but one that also returned to fashion in the 19th century, the production draws attention to the multi-generational timescale of the Count's life. He exists in multiple pasts as much as the present. And along with these critics in their exploration of Gothic cloth, Sophia Joachim and Cordula Lemke also see the cape as a signifier for the vampire in the cultural imagination. However, at this point in my talk, I want to kind of turn to their assumption that the black cape, intriguingly, cannot be found in Stoker's novel, nor in his British predecessors. John William Polidori's and Sheridan Le Fanu's vampires are attired in the dress of the times and pass as stereotypical aristocrats. So in direct contrast with this statement, however, I want to make the case here that actually the cape, or more specifically a cloak, does appear in Stoker's 1897 novel. And much more than this, various aspects of the text's narrative, environs, and kind of characters' psyches become cloaked in the narrative too. So to make this argument, I'd like to first turn to the definitions of cape and cloak as terms in the Oxford English Dictionary. Here, a cape is a cloak with a hood, a cloak or a mantle generally. So according to the OED, these terms are kind of interchangeable. A cape is a cloak with or without a hood, whilst a cloak on its own might be deemed as a kind of loose outer garment worn over clothes. Equally, in its verb form, to cloak means to cover, to conceal, to disguise, or to wear the semblance of. In Dracula's terms, the cloak is both a physical garment, but in the very act of wearing it, it also acts as an object that enables concealment and disguise. It obscures and transforms the wearer. And with these interconnected meanings in mind, I'm now going to turn to Stoker's original text and demonstrate that through some kind of close readings, how the cloak features and pervades the original novel too. So, the first time that the cloak appears is when Jonathan Harker arrives in Transylvania and is collected by a coach driven by a disguised Dracula. Harker remarks that, "I felt a strange chill and a lonely feeling came over me, but a cloak was thrown over my shoulders and a rug across my knees." And the driver said in excellent German, The night is chill, mynheer, and my master the Count bade me take all care of you. There is a flask of Slivovitz, the plum brandy of the country, underneath the seat if you should require it. There's both a cloak and a couple of what I'm going to refer to as cloakings that take place here. Firstly, Dracula's cloak, rug, and plum brandy are laid at Harker's disposal simply because it's a cold night. It's also notable that Dracula's own identity is cloaked or concealed behind the disguise of a Germanic coach driver. In addition to this, in this guise, Dracula physically becloaks Harker as he throws the garment around his shoulders. And with this in mind, we see one of the first exchanges of clothing in the novel. And during Harker's subsequent captivity at the castle, Dracula dresses himself in Harker's clothes as he leaves for his voyage for England. On peering out of his window, Harker sees that Dracula had on the suit of clothes which I had worn whilst travelling here. Elsewhere, and much later in the novel, Dr. Seward remarks in his journal that it's odd to notice that by common consent we had all put on black clothes by instinct. And Dracula is notably clad in black from head to foot, and in a couple of instances in the novel as well. And so Harker, Seward, and the team of hunters in that kind of example in the middle might be interpreted as subconsciously imitating the material appearance of the very vampire that they're pursuing. And in the exchange or swapping of clothes in the novel, there's not necessarily a switching, I'd say, but a kind of blurring of identities. But it's notable that the first exchange between any character and Dracula isn't a verbal one, but a cloth-based encounter too. And the second instance wherein Dracula's cloak makes an appearance is in a scene I alluded to a little bit earlier when discussing Dean's adaptation. Again, this is from the perspective of Harker when he's being kept at Dracula's castle, and once again, in looking out from a window, Harker is struck by Dracula's behaviour, the nature of his garb, and in the interplay between these two things, as he remarks that I saw the whole man slowly emerge from the window and begin to crawl down the castle wall over that dreadful abyss, face down, with his cloak spreading out around him like great wings. At first, I could not believe my eyes. I thought it was some trick of the moonlight, some weird effect of shadow. But I kept looking, and it could be no delusion. I saw the fingers and toes grasp the corners of the stones, worn clear of the mortar by the stress of the years, and by thus using every projection and inequality, move downwards with considerable speed, just as a lizard moves along a wall. And as anyone who's read or studied the novel might know, this scene can be very much seen in the context of 19th century scientific and cultural discourses around Darwinism and kind of connected fears around degeneration. So in Harker's and therefore Stoker's description here, Dracula is realised in somewhat reptilian terms as he crawls down the castle, grasping the stones with his fingers and toes just as a lizard moves along a wall. So Dracula here has regressed into some kind of primeval creature in this case. Moreover, much like Dean's ambitious prologue for the 1924 play, the cloak plays a vital role in contributing to this physicality as it spreads out around him like great wings. And as you can see from the image on the slide, and if you just Google image this scene more widely, the cloak plays a vital role in the creative depictions and illustrations for the novel too. Furthermore, I would argue that as Dracula throws no shadow, the cloak functions as a material substitute at his shoulder. And much more than this, I put forward that there are connections to be made between the novel's cloakings and its depictions of darkness and shadow more widely. The main character himself, though he doesn't throw a shadow, very much inhabits the shadows around the peripheries of the text. As Harker notes in his journal, at Carfax, somewhere looking out from the shadow, I seemed to see the highlights of the Count's evil face, the ridge of the nose, the red eyes, the red lips, the awful pallor. It was only for a moment, for as Lord Godalming said, I thought I saw a face, but it was only the shadows. So in looking out from his retreat, Dracula paradoxically reveals and conceals himself simultaneously. He's cloaked and unveiled through shadow at the same time. Of course, as I'm sure you're aware, the utilization of darkness and shadow as metaphor, symbol, and setting is nothing new to Gothic literature or Gothic media more widely at this point. As Fred Bossing remarks in his landmark study of the genre, in the Gothic, we're dealing with what he refers to as a negative aesthetic. Darkness characterizes the looks, moods, atmospheres, and connotations of the genre. And as an extension of this, the use of obscurity, the interplay of light and shadow, and the partial visibility of objects in semi-darkness through veils or behind screens denies a clearly visible and safe picture of the world. Disorientation elicits anxiety or extends a stimulating or scary sense of mystery and the unknown. So darkness and the absence of light characterizes the Gothic, and as an extension of this, shadows cloak and obscure visibility and deny the reader or audience any sense of security in their worldview. It's unsurprising then that Dracula exists within the shadows. Moreover, the shadows that Dracula exists within pervade the novel and its settings. In Stoker's descriptions, the shadows themselves take on a tactile, cloak-like form of expression. In particular, this is evident in the depictions of the landscape around Dracula's castle. So when Harker nears the castle, he notes that the shadows of the evening began to creep around us. They start to encircle him and those around him in a threatening way. More specifically, whilst once again looking out of the window at the castle, Harker participates in a picturesque assessment of the surroundings in moonlight, noting that the shadows in the valleys and gorges are of a velvety blackness, and elsewhere the rivers appear as silver threads through the same chasms. The shadows are material and immaterial all at once. And Dracula embodies the shadows, but in return they also embody him. They are a visual signifier of the Count's predatory control, but also they evoke and anticipate his cloaked characterization that finds form in Bela Lugosi's silk-lined cape much later. And Stoker's use of shadow as a shorthand for Dracula's influence is not just the product of Harker's imagination either. This distinction continues as the vampire relocates to Whitby, where he finds and becomes a threat to Mina Harker and Lucy Westenra. In a notable and shadowy set piece, Mina mantles herself in a shawl and heads to Whitby Abbey in search of her friend. On this journey, she notices the heavy black driving clouds and the shadows that seem to take on an obscuring agency of their own, or as the reader knows, at the will of Dracula himself. And in a moment that finds an echo in that film clip I referred to earlier, as Lugosi's Dracula envelops Mina in his cape, here in the novel, the clouds and shadows encircle and conceal Dracula's attack on the white figure of Lucy, from Mina's and the reader's viewpoint. The Count is something dark bent over his victim, and the dark elements around him act as an extension of his physicality, covering and concealing his predatory act. And lastly, beyond character and setting, the influence of Dracula's cloaking extends to the psyches of the main characters that oppose him, as emotions blend with the Gothic surfaces depicted in the text. For instance, Mina refers to some sort of shadowy pall that seems to be coming over our happiness. A pall is a cloth, usually spread over a coffin, hearse, tomb, or corpse. So it has funereal and therefore foreboding associations for the narrative here. However, again, to go back to the OED, a pall is also defined as a robe, cloak, or mantle, especially one made of rich fabric. So either way, this description employed by Mina, and therefore Stoker, corresponds with the atmospheres and I suppose the sheer amount of death that happens in the novel. Out of the characters she names in this quotation, 2 out of 3 meet their end before the novel's conclusion, though I hope that isn't a spoiler to anyone here. But it also speaks to the text's broader interest in textiles, in descriptions on, around, in relation to, and as an extension of the main character. elsewhere on leaving Dracula's chapel at Carfax with the other vampire hunters. And in this movement, Jonathan Harker notes that the shadow of dread seemed to slip from us like a robe. Their emotions in this scene, like the pall hanging over Mina's happiness, are equated with the long outer garment worn and employed by Dracula himself. These tangible emotions are restrictive until the characters are out of the vampire's proximity. And as Dr. Seward remarked, until these characters knit together every scrap of evidence they have, they cannot counter his attacks in any material way. So drawing this all together in conclusion then, and as I've hopefully shown, Dracula the novel can be seen to be shrouded in cloaks of various physical, notional and metaphorical kinds. Though the term cape never admittedly appears in the text, it's actually synonymous with a network of cloth and cloak associated terminology deployed by Stoker and his characters. And these material expressions are indicative of Dracula's all-encompassing power as a vampire. And now, of course, this doesn't minimise the significance of the cape, which first appeared on stage at Derby, and which was subsequently embodied by Lugosi and in other theatrical adaptations. In fact, in the stage and screen adaptations, the prevalence of the cape or cloak might be identified as a visual signifier of Stoker's textual descriptions. And I think as an audience of both the novel and its various cultural afterlives, we can actually view the various expressions of this garment to be in direct connection with one another. And that's me. I'll finish there. Thank you for listening.
Oh, thanks, Anna. That was fascinating. We've got time for a few quick questions. So if anybody has a question, either type it into chat or just unmute and ask it. So does anybody want to ask a question?
I have a question.
Yeah, please go ahead.
So thank you, Anna, for a very interesting presentation. I'm wondering about the significance of the stand-up portion of the cloak that later became associated with Dracula, that sort of rises up from his neck up to, almost the height of his head in some cases. It's obviously not there in the Lugosi Dracula, and as you've explained, it's certainly not there in the novel. When did that start to appear, and what's the significance of that, do you think?
I'm not sure exactly where that first appeared. I mean, I think that certainly, to my mind, links up with the kind of Raymond Huntley kind of opera cloak. I'm not entirely sure. I'd have to look back at the image whether that appears there, but it's certainly something that I think evolved through the productions. But I'm sorry, I don't know when the kind. I know the bit you mean, kind of where it sort of encroaches further and further up his head. I'm not entirely sure exactly when. I think it's just a kind of development of styling of the cape more broadly.
Thanks.
Okay, thank you. Anybody else got any questions for Anna?
I had a question about the film image, the poster image from 1931. Do you know that is a 1931 poster? Because I've also been, perhaps if you could even show it. I've also been digging into some of this, and I found, wasn't the film reissued was it the 1950s? I'm just clutching at the date, but
Yes.
I noticed that some of the film images, some of the posters, they go with the reissue, which is quite a few years later, and I'm now quite careful about that image. Yeah, is that
sorry, it says a Universal re-release at the bottom.
Do you know that's a
guessing
1931 image? Because some of my own digging, I'm interested in the color of the lining. That's what I've been researching, and where that all came from. But I don't want to say I got myself into a pickle. But as part of that research, I realized that even though some of these things said this is the poster that goes with the film, when I've done a bit more digging, and that isn't quite true. It goes with the reissue, and the reason why that's significant is because I think by the time of the reissue, some of these features, just like you were talking about the high collar, some of these features now start to appear as part of the posters, the promotional material in the reissues, that weren't actually present earlier on in the original film. They're almost picking up on. I can't put it into words. Yeah. They're almost picking up on things that have happened over the public perceptions that have changed over that 20 or 10-year period, and they've then been incorporating them into the re-releases of the posters or the adaptation of the posters.
Well, that's fascinating in itself, isn't it? To think about
Oh, absolutely,
the evolution of the character, even in that space of the re-release. I think you're right. That says it's a universal re-release. It's probably from a kind of later reissue of the film, as you say.
I do wonder with that image that is the case with that particular image, because it may be one that I've tried to track down, and there's certainly somewhere there's some promotional stills, and again it shows it with like a red the coat with the cape with the cloak with the red lining.
Okay, it's gone 1 o'clock, so I think we're going to have to draw it to a close. You might want to have a look at the chat, Anna, because some people have been expressing their appreciation for your talk in the chat. On behalf of everybody here, can I say a huge thank you to Anna, and can I invite you to do likewise using the react icons, or just give her a clap? So, thank you very much.